Before we dive into this wild story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Picture this: you're sitting by your own private lake, roasting marshmallows under the stars on land you've owned for 20 years, when suddenly police cars come racing down your driveway with their lights flashing. The officers jump out and start yelling at you to pack up your tent and leave immediately because you're trespassing on HOA property. But here's the kicker: you're not just camping on your own land. You're about to discover that your homeowners association has been illegally using your property for years, collecting fees from neighbors for lake access that was never theirs to give. The moment you pull out your property deed to show the confused officers, everything changes, and what happens next will leave your jaw on the ground. But let me start from the beginning so you can understand how this crazy situation even happened. My name is Jake, and I'm a 45-year-old carpenter who worked hard my whole life to buy a little piece of paradise. 20 years ago, I purchased a beautiful 15-acre ranch about an hour outside of Austin, Texas. The property came with rolling hills, tall oak trees, and best of all, a gorgeous 3-acre lake right in the middle of it. It was my dream come true, a place where I could escape from the busy world and just breathe. When I first bought the land, it was pretty isolated. My nearest neighbor was about a half-mile away, and I loved the peace and quiet. I built a small cabin near the lake where I'd spend weekends fishing, reading, and working on woodworking projects. Life was simple and good. Over the years, things started changing around my property. New houses began popping up like mushrooms after rain. What used to be farmland and empty lots slowly turned into a fancy neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. The houses were big and expensive, with perfectly manicured lawns and 3-car garages. It wasn't really my style, but I figured live and let live, right? About 5 years ago, the new neighbors formed a homeowners association. Now, I want to be clear about something important: my property was never part of this HOA. I never signed any papers, never paid any fees, and never agreed to follow their rules. My land existed long before their neighborhood, and legally, I had nothing to do with their organization. But that didn't stop them from trying to include me. I started getting letters in the mail addressed to Willow Creek Estates resident with my address on them. The letters talked about HOA meetings, dues payments, and community rules. At first, I just threw them in the trash. I figured someone made a mistake with their mailing list. Then the visit started. A woman named Margaret Thompson, who called herself the HOA president, showed up at my door one Saturday morning. She was about 50 years old, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. She wore a bright pink blazer and carried a fancy leather folder filled with papers. "Good morning, Mr. Jake," she said in a voice that sounded sweet but felt cold. "I'm Margaret Thompson, the president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. I wanted to personally welcome you to our community and discuss your membership." I leaned against my doorframe and crossed my arms. "Ma'am, I appreciate the visit, but I'm not part of your HOA. My property isn't in your development." Margaret's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, I think there might be some confusion. Your property is definitely within our community boundaries. We have maps and everything." She opened her folder and pulled out a colorful map that showed the neighborhood. Sure enough, my property was colored in with the same shade as all the other HOA homes. "That map is wrong," I told her politely. "I've owned this land for 15 years, long before your neighborhood existed. I never signed anything agreeing to be part of your association." Margaret's voice got a little sharper. "Well, regardless of when you bought your property, you're now part of our community. Property values have gone up because of the wonderful amenities we provide, including access to recreational facilities. The least you could do is pay your fair share." I was getting confused. "What recreational facilities? I don't use anything your HOA provides." "The lake access, of course," Margaret said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Our residents pay premium HOA fees partly because they have access to the beautiful lake for fishing, swimming, and boating. It's one of our main selling points." My blood started to get warm. "Ma'am, that's my lake. It's on my property. I've never given anyone permission to use it." Margaret laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. Don't be ridiculous. That lake belongs to the community. It's clearly marked on all our property maps as a community amenity. You can't just claim ownership of community property. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. Even though I was getting angry, I remembered what my grandmother always taught me: kill them with kindness, Jake. When people are being difficult, show them grace. Sometimes they don't know any better. Look, Mrs. Thompson, I said, keeping my voice gentle. I think we have a misunderstanding here. Why don't you check with your developers or lawyers about the property lines? I'm sure we can clear this up without any problems. Margaret's face was getting red. There's nothing to clear up. You need to start paying your HOA dues immediately, or we'll have to take legal action. The community has invested a lot of money in maintaining that lake area. Maintaining it how? I asked. I take care of my own property. We've installed picnic tables, a small dock, and walking paths around the lake. We even stock it with fish every spring for the community fishing tournaments. I stared at her. You did what? You put things on my land without asking me? It's not your land. Margaret snapped, dropping her sweet act completely. It's community property, and you're just being difficult. Either pay your dues or face the consequences. With that, she turned around and marched back to her shiny SUV, leaving me standing there with my mouth hanging open. After Margaret left, I decided to take a walk around my lake to see what she was talking about. Sure enough, there were things that didn't belong there. Someone had installed a wooden dock on the north side of the lake, a nice one too, with built-in benches and a small roof. There were 3 picnic tables scattered around the shoreline and a gravel walking path that made a complete circle around the water. At first, I felt angry. How dare they put things on my property without asking? But then I started thinking about it differently. Maybe they genuinely didn't know the lake belonged to me. Maybe their developer had made a mistake when drawing up their community plans. It seemed like an honest error that could be fixed with some good communication. Over the next few weeks, I tried to handle the situation with kindness and understanding. I called the HOA office and spoke to their secretary, a nice lady named Betty who seemed genuinely surprised to learn that the lake might not be community property. Oh my, Betty said over the phone. That's quite a situation. Let me have our property manager look into it and get back to you. I also reached out to some of my new neighbors directly. Most of them were actually pretty nice people when you talked to them one-on-one. There was Tom Rodriguez, a retired teacher who loved to fish early in the mornings. Sarah Chen, a nurse who brought her kids to feed the ducks on weekends. And elderly Mr. Franklin, who enjoyed sitting by the water reading his newspaper. When I explained the situation to them, they were all shocked and apologetic. I had no idea it was your private property, Tom said, looking embarrassed. The HOA told us it was a community lake when we bought our house. I'm so sorry for fishing there without your permission. Please don't apologize, I told him. You didn't know. And honestly, you're welcome to keep fishing there. I love seeing people enjoy the outdoors. Sarah looked worried. But we've been paying extra HOA fees for lake access. If it's not actually community property, what happens to that money? That was a great question, and I was starting to wonder the same thing. I decided to do some research at the county courthouse. I pulled up all the property records, deeds, and surveys for my land and the surrounding area. Everything confirmed what I already knew: the lake was 100% on my property and always had been. There was no legal way the HOA could claim ownership of it. Armed with this information, I requested a meeting with the HOA board. Margaret Thompson agreed to meet with me, along with 2 other board members, Robert Kim, the treasurer, and Linda Martinez, the secretary. We met at the community center in Willow Creek Estates, a fancy building with marble floors and leather chairs. I brought copies of all my property documents, thinking this would be a simple matter of showing them the proof and working out a solution. Thank you for coming, Mr. Jake, Margaret said, though she didn't sound thankful at all. I hope we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly. I spread my documents out on the conference table. I think these will clear everything up. Here's my original deed from 20 years ago, the property survey, and the most recent county records. As you can see, the lake is entirely within my property boundaries. Robert Kim, a tall man with glasses, studied the papers carefully. After a few minutes, he looked up and nodded. These documents appear to be legitimate. It does look like the lake is on your property. I felt relieved. Finally, some progress. But Margaret wasn't giving up so easily. Documents can be forged, she said coldly. And even if they're real, things might have changed over the years. Property lines can shift. Linda Martinez, who had been quiet up to this point, spoke up. Margaret, these are official county records. I don't think they can be wrong. Of course they can be wrong. Margaret snapped. Government offices make mistakes all the time. What matters is that our residents have been paying for lake access for years. We can't just take that away from them because of some paperwork mix-up. I tried to stay patient. Mrs. Thompson, I'm not trying to take anything away from anyone. I'm just trying to establish the facts. Once we know who actually owns what, we can figure out a fair solution for everyone. The fair solution is for you to pay your HOA dues like everyone else, Margaret said, her voice getting louder. You're benefiting from our community improvements whether you want to admit it or not. What improvements? I asked. The picnic tables and dock that you put on my land without asking. Improvements that increased your property value. Margaret shot back. You should be thanking us, not complaining. The meeting went downhill from there. Margaret refused to acknowledge that the documents proved anything, and she kept insisting that I owed the HOA money. Robert and Linda seemed uncomfortable with her attitude, but they didn't speak up against their president. Finally, I stood up to leave. Look, I came here hoping we could work this out like reasonable adults. I'm willing to let your residents continue using the lake, but we need to establish some basic ground rules and figure out what to do about the fees you've been collecting. The only rule we need, Margaret said, standing up and pointing her finger at me, is that you pay your dues or face the consequences. This community won't be held hostage by one selfish person. I gathered up my papers and headed for the door. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Thompson. I hope you'll reconsider once you've had time to think about it. As I walked out, I heard Margaret telling the other board members, don't worry about him. We have ways of dealing with troublemakers. That comment should have been a warning, but I was still trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. I believed that most people were basically good and that conflicts could be resolved through kindness and understanding. My grandmother had always taught me to look for the best in others, even when they weren't showing their best to you. Over the next few months, I continued to allow HOA residents to use the lake. Tom still came fishing in the mornings, and Sarah still brought her kids to feed the ducks. Mr. Franklin still read his newspaper by the water. I enjoyed chatting with them and hearing about their lives. These interactions reminded me why I loved this property so much. It brought out the peaceful, happy side of people. But not everyone in the HOA was happy with the situation. I started getting nasty letters in the mail, obviously written by Margaret or her supporters. They accused me of being greedy, selfish, and anti-community. Some letters even contained threats about legal action or other measures if I didn't start cooperating. I tried not to let the negativity get to me. I focused on my woodworking, spent time with the friendly neighbors, and enjoyed the beautiful sunsets over the lake. Life was still good, even with the HOA drama in the background. Then one day in early September, something happened that changed everything. I had decided to take a few days off work and go camping by the lake. I'd done this dozens of times over the years. It was one of my favorite ways to relax and recharge. I set up my tent in a clearing about 50 feet from the water's edge, built a small fire pit, and prepared for a peaceful few days of fishing and reading. The first night was perfect. The weather was warm but not too hot, and there was a gentle breeze that kept the mosquitoes away. I cooked a simple dinner over the campfire and watched the stars come out over the water. This was exactly what I needed after months of dealing with HOA stress. But my peaceful evening was about to be interrupted in the most shocking way possible. I was just settling into my sleeping bag, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the shore, when I heard the rumble of vehicles coming down my driveway. At first, I thought maybe it was Tom coming for an early morning fishing trip, though it seemed awfully late for that. But then I saw the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness, and my heart started pounding. 2 police cars pulled up near my campsite, their headlights flooding the area with harsh white light. 4 officers got out, and I could see their hands resting on their weapons as they approached my tent. "This is the police," one of them shouted. "Come out of the tent with your hands visible." I unzipped my tent flap and crawled out slowly, raising my hands to show I wasn't a threat. "Officers, what's going on? Is everything okay?" The lead officer, a tall man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "Sir, we've received reports that you're trespassing on private property. This area belongs to the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and camping is not permitted here." I blinked in confusion. "Officers, I think there's been a mistake. This is my property. I own this land." "Do you have any identification or proof of ownership?" another officer asked. "Of course," I said, reaching slowly toward my backpack. "My wallet has my ID, and I keep copies of my property documents in my truck." As I walked toward my pickup truck with the officers following, I explained the situation. "My name is Jake Peterson, and I've owned this land for 20 years. There's been an ongoing dispute with the HOA because they mistakenly think they have rights to this lake." The lead officer, whose name tag read Martinez, looked skeptical. "Sir, we received a call from Margaret Thompson, the HOA president. She was very clear that this is community property and that you've been asked multiple times to stop trespassing." I pulled out my wallet and handed over my driver's license, then retrieved the folder of property documents from my glove compartment. "Officer Martinez, here's my ID, and these are my property deeds and surveys. You can see that this lake and all the surrounding land belongs to me." Officer Martinez examined the documents with his flashlight while the other officers kept a close eye on me. After several minutes, he looked up with a puzzled expression. "These documents appear legitimate," he said slowly. "But Mrs. Thompson was very insistent that you were trespassing. She said the HOA has been dealing with this problem for months." "They have been dealing with a problem," I agreed, "but not the one they think. The problem is that they've been collecting fees from residents for access to my private lake without my permission. I've been trying to work with them to resolve this peacefully." Another officer, a woman whose name tag read Johnson, spoke up. "Sir, if this is really your property, why didn't you just call us yourself to report the HOA for trespassing?" That was a fair question, and it made me think about my approach to this whole situation. "Officer Johnson, I guess I was trying to handle this the nice way. These people are my neighbors, and I didn't want to cause trouble. I kept hoping we could work it out through conversation and compromise." Officer Martinez handed my documents back to me. "Mr. Peterson, based on these papers, it does appear that you're the legal owner of this property. However, we're going to need to verify this information before we can close this matter. In the meantime, I'd recommend avoiding any further conflicts with the HOA." "I'm not trying to have conflicts with anyone," I said, feeling frustrated. "I just want to camp on my own land in peace." After the officers left, I tried to go back to sleep, but my mind was racing. The fact that Margaret Thompson had called the police on me for camping on my own property showed just how far she was willing to go to maintain her version of reality. It also made me realize that my strategy of killing them with kindness wasn't working. The next morning, I packed up my campsite and drove home to think about what to do next. I felt disappointed that my peaceful camping trip had been ruined, but I also felt a growing determination to stand up for my rights. My grandmother had taught me to be kind and understanding, but she'd also taught me not to let people walk all over me. I decided to call my lawyer, a friend named David Chen who had helped me with the original property purchase 20 years ago. When I explained the situation, David was amazed. "Jake, this is incredible," he said over the phone. "If what you're telling me is true, this HOA has been committing fraud by collecting fees for access to property they don't own. This could be a serious legal matter." "I don't want to sue anyone," I told him. "I just want them to acknowledge the truth and stop harassing me." "I understand your position," David said, "but sometimes legal action is the only way to get people's attention. Let me do some research and see what our options are. While David worked on the legal aspects, I decided to reach out to some of the reasonable HOA residents I'd met. I started with Tom Rodriguez, the retired teacher who loved to fish. "Tom, I need to tell you something important," I said when I called him. "Last night, the HOA president called the police on me for camping on my own property. They told the officers I was trespassing." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Jake, that's terrible. I can't believe Margaret would do something like that." "I'm starting to realize that this situation is more serious than I thought," I continued. "The HOA has been collecting fees from residents for lake access, but they don't actually have any legal right to that lake. It's fraud, Tom." "What can we do?" Tom asked. "I mean, I've been paying those fees for 3 years now. If the lake access isn't legitimate, I want my money back." "I think we need to organize," I said. "The reasonable residents like you need to know what's really going on. Margaret Thompson is lying to everyone, including the police." Tom agreed to help spread the word to other residents. Over the next few days, I had conversations with Sarah Chen, Mr. Franklin, and several other neighbors. Most of them were shocked to learn the truth and angry about being deceived by their own HOA leadership. Sarah was particularly upset. "I specifically chose this house because of the lake access," she told me. "It was one of the main selling points. If I'd known it wasn't actually part of the community, I might have looked elsewhere." "The lake access can still be part of the community," I assured her. "I'm happy to work out a formal agreement that gives residents legitimate access. But it needs to be done honestly and legally." Meanwhile, Margaret Thompson wasn't giving up her fight. I started receiving even more aggressive letters from the HOA, now threatening immediate legal action if I didn't pay dues and stop interfering with community property. She also began organizing other residents against me, spreading rumors that I was trying to steal the lake from the community. One afternoon, I was working in my workshop when I heard a commotion outside. I looked out the window and saw about 15 people marching up my driveway, led by Margaret Thompson. They were carrying signs that read, "Community Rights," and "Stop the Land Grab." I walked outside to meet them, trying to stay calm and friendly despite feeling ambushed. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said with a wave. "What can I do for you?" Margaret stepped forward, her face red with anger. "You can stop this nonsense about owning our lake. The community has invested thousands of dollars in that recreational area, and we won't let one selfish person destroy what we've built." "Mrs. Thompson," I said patiently, "I've shown you the legal documents proving that the lake is on my property. I'm not trying to destroy anything or hurt anyone. I just want to establish the facts. Your so-called documents don't mean anything." Margaret shouted. "We have rights too. We have a community to protect." Some of the protesters behind her started chanting, "Community rights. Community rights." But I noticed that several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable, including a few faces I recognized as residents I'd spoken with recently. "Look," I said, raising my voice to address the whole group, "I understand everyone's concerns. You were told that lake access was part of your community amenities, and you've been paying for that access. But the truth is, the HOA leadership made a mistake when they included my private property in their community plans. I'm willing to work with everyone to find a fair solution, but first we need to acknowledge reality." "The reality," Margaret said, pointing her finger at me, "is that you're trying to cheat honest families out of something they've paid for fair and square." "I'm not trying to cheat anyone," I replied. "If people have been paying for something they shouldn't have been charged for, then the HOA owes them refunds or needs to find another way to provide the amenities they promised." This seemed to get some people thinking. I could see murmurs going through the crowd as residents started to consider the implications of what I was saying. But Margaret wasn't done. "You think you can just waltz in here with some old papers and take away our community lake? Well, we won't stand for it. If you don't start cooperating, we'll make sure you regret it." The threat in her voice was clear, and it sent a chill down my spine. But I tried to respond with grace, just like my grandmother had taught me. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry you're so upset about this situation. I really do want to find a solution that works for everyone. Why don't we set up a proper meeting with lawyers present so we can discuss this calmly and professionally? We're done talking. Margaret snapped. From now on, you deal with our lawyers. And if you step foot near that lake again, we'll have you arrested for trespassing. With that, she turned and marched back down the driveway, with most of the protesters following her. But I noticed that a few people stayed behind, including Tom Rodriguez and an older woman I didn't recognize. Jake, I'm so sorry about this, Tom said, looking embarrassed. Margaret told everyone you were trying to steal community property, but she didn't mention that you have legal documents proving ownership. The older woman stepped forward. My name is Dorothy Williams, and I live on Maple Street. I've been watching this situation develop, and I think you're being treated very unfairly. Margaret Thompson has been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for too long. Thank you, Mrs. Williams, I said, feeling grateful for their support. I really don't want to fight with anyone. I just want the truth to come out. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, Dorothy said with a knowing smile. And I have a feeling Margaret Thompson is about to learn that lesson the hard way. Over the next week, the situation continued to escalate. The HOA hired a lawyer who sent me an official cease and desist letter, demanding that I stop making false claims about community property and threatening to sue me for interference with community amenities. But my lawyer David had been busy too. He'd done extensive research on the property records and discovered something that made the situation even more interesting. Jake, you're not going to believe this, David told me over the phone. I've been looking into how the HOA was formed and how they developed their community maps. It turns out that the original developer, a company called Sunrise Properties, included your lake on their marketing materials and community plans without ever checking the actual property boundaries. You mean they never even tried to verify that they had rights to the lake? I asked. Exactly. They just assumed that because your property was in the middle of their development area, they could include it in their community amenities. Then when they sold lots to homebuilders, they advertised lake access as one of the selling points. The HOA inherited this mistake when they took over from the developer. This was fascinating, but it also made me feel bad for the residents who had been deceived. So people really were told they'd have lake access when they bought their homes? Yes, but that doesn't make it legal, David explained. The developer and the HOA made promises they couldn't keep because they were giving away access to someone else's property. The residents have been victims of this fraud just as much as you have. Armed with this new information, I decided to try one more time to reach out to the HOA board for a reasonable discussion. I sent a certified letter to Margaret Thompson, along with all the property documentation and David's research about the original developer's mistake. In the letter, I proposed a simple solution. The HOA could admit their mistake, work with me to create a legal access agreement for the lake, and figure out how to compensate residents who had been paying fees for access they shouldn't have been charged for. Everyone could win if we just handled this honestly and fairly. I never received a direct response to that letter. Instead, 3 days later, I got a visit that showed me just how far Margaret Thompson was willing to go to avoid admitting the truth. I was having my morning coffee on my porch when I saw a county inspector's truck pull into my driveway. A man in a uniform got out and walked up to my house with a clipboard and a serious expression. "Good morning, sir. I'm Inspector Williams from the County Zoning Department. We've received complaints about illegal structures and activities on this property. I need to conduct a full inspection." "What kind of complaints?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea who was behind this. Inspector Williams consulted his clipboard. "Reports of unauthorized camping facilities, unpermitted structures near a body of water, and possible violations of environmental protection regulations." I realized that Margaret Thompson had decided to escalate this conflict by bringing in government agencies to harass me. If she couldn't win through honest means, she was going to try to make my life miserable until I gave up. "Inspector, you're welcome to look around," I said, trying to stay calm. "But I think you should know that these complaints are probably related to an ongoing property dispute with the local HOA. They've been claiming ownership of my lake, and now they're trying to use government agencies to pressure me." Inspector Williams spent 3 hours going over every inch of my property. He examined my cabin, my workshop, the area where I'd been camping, and every structure around the lake, including the dock and picnic tables that the HOA had installed without my permission. When he was finished, he came back to talk to me. "Mr. Peterson, I have to tell you something interesting. Most of the structures that were reported as unauthorized actually appear to have been built by someone else. That dock and those picnic tables don't match the construction style of your other buildings. That's because the HOA built them," I explained. "They put those things on my property without asking permission, and now they're complaining to you about unauthorized structures." Inspector Williams shook his head. "In 30 years of doing this job, I've never seen anything quite like this situation. The people who filed the complaint are actually the ones who created most of the violations they're complaining about." "So what happens now?" I asked. "Well, technically, those structures do need permits if they're going to stay. But since you didn't build them, you're not responsible for the violations. However, you are responsible for getting them either permitted or removed since they're on your property." This gave me an idea. "Inspector Williams, what if I wanted to file my own complaint about unauthorized structures being built on my land without my permission?" Inspector Williams raised an eyebrows. "That would be a separate matter, but yes, you certainly have the right to file such a complaint. Building on someone else's property without permission is a serious violation." After Inspector Williams left, I sat on my porch thinking about how this situation had spiraled so far out of control. All I'd wanted was to camp peacefully on my own land, but now I was dealing with police calls, protest marches, legal threats, and government inspections. Margaret Thompson's refusal to acknowledge the truth was turning a simple property dispute into a full-scale war. That evening, I got a call from Tom Rodriguez that made everything even more complicated. "Jake, I need to tell you something," Tom said, his voice tense. "Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting tonight. She told everyone that you've been filing false complaints with the county to get revenge on the community." "That's not true," I said. "The county inspector came here because of complaints that Margaret filed against me. I know that, and so do several other people who've been paying attention. But Margaret has a way of twisting the truth to make herself look like the victim. She's also saying that if this dispute continues, everyone's property values will drop because of the legal uncertainty. This was a smart move on Margaret's part. Property values were something that would get every homeowner's attention, regardless of who was right or wrong in the original dispute." "What else did she say?" I asked. "She's proposing that the HOA take legal action to claim ownership of the lake through something called adverse possession. She says that since the community has been using and maintaining the lake for several years, they can legally claim it even if your documents say you own it." I felt my stomach drop. Adverse possession was a real legal concept where someone could potentially claim ownership of property if they used it openly for a certain period of time while the real owner didn't object. But in Texas, the requirements were pretty strict, and I didn't think the HOA met them. Still, a legal battle over adverse possession could drag on for years and cost both sides tens of thousands of dollars. "Tom, did anyone at the meeting object to this plan?" I asked. A few people asked questions about the costs and whether it was really necessary. Dorothy Williams spoke up and said the HOA should just admit they made a mistake and work with you to find a fair solution. But Margaret shut her down pretty quickly. "What's the next step?" "Margaret is calling for a special vote next week. If the majority of residents approve, the HOA will hire a law firm that specializes in property disputes and file a lawsuit claiming ownership of your lake." After I hung up with Tom, I realized that my approach of trying to handle this situation with kindness and patience had failed completely. Margaret Thompson was determined to fight this battle no matter what the cost, and she was willing to drag the entire community into an expensive legal war rather than admit she'd made a mistake. I called my lawyer David to tell him about the adverse possession threat. "Jake, this is getting serious," David said. "Even though I don't think they have a strong adverse possession claim, defending against that kind of lawsuit could cost you $50,000 or more. And there's always some risk when you go to court, even when you're clearly in the right. So what are my options?" I asked. "Well, we could file our own lawsuit first. We could sue the HOA for trespassing, for fraud in collecting fees for access to property they don't own, and for harassment. We might also be able to sue the original developer for creating this mess in the first place. I don't want to sue anyone, I said, feeling tired of the whole situation. I just want to live in peace on my own land. I understand that, Jake, but sometimes you have to fight back to protect yourself. If you don't take action, Margaret Thompson is going to keep escalating this until it destroys your life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandmother's advice about kindness and empathy, but I also thought about another thing she used to say: sometimes, Jake, the kindest thing you can do is stop enabling someone's bad behavior. Maybe it was time to stop being so nice and start standing up for myself properly. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop playing defense and go on the offense. But first, I needed to gather more evidence about what the HOA had really been doing. I spent the day talking to residents throughout the Willow Creek Estates neighborhood, asking them about their experiences with the HOA and what they'd been told about the lake access. What I discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. Not only had the HOA been collecting fees for my lake access, but they'd been charging premium prices for it. Residents were paying an extra $200 per year specifically for recreational amenities, with the lake being the main attraction. Over the past 5 years, with about 150 homes in the development, that meant the HOA had collected roughly $150,000 in fees for access to property they didn't own. But here's where it got really interesting: I also learned that Margaret Thompson had been using some of that money for personal expenses. According to Dorothy Williams, who had been asking questions about the HOA budget, Margaret had been paying herself a $2,000 monthly management fee and had used HOA funds to pay for expensive landscaping around her own house, claiming it was for community beautification. Jake, I think Margaret is stealing from the HOA, Dorothy told me when we met at a coffee shop in town. I've been trying to get other residents to pay attention to the financial records, but most people just trust that everything is being handled properly. Do you have any proof of this? I asked. Some, but not everything. Margaret controls all the financial records, and she's very secretive about them. But I have copies of some invoices that show HOA money being spent on things that only benefit her property. This put a whole new perspective on why Margaret was fighting so hard to maintain the status quo. It wasn't just about being right or wrong, she had been profiting personally from the situation, and admitting the truth about the lake would expose her financial misconduct. I realized that I was dealing with more than just a stubborn HOA president. I was dealing with someone who was potentially committing fraud and embezzlement, and who would go to great lengths to cover up her crimes. That afternoon, I called David and told him everything I'd learned. Jake, this changes everything, David said. If Margaret Thompson has been embezzling HOA funds, we're not just talking about a property dispute anymore. We're talking about criminal activity. The residents who've been paying those fees are victims, and they deserve to know what's been happening with their money. What should we do? I asked. First, we need to document everything carefully. Then I think we need to contact the district attorney's office. Financial crimes against homeowners associations are taken very seriously in Texas. Won't that just make Margaret even more desperate and dangerous? I asked. Probably, David admitted. But Jake, you can't let fear of retaliation stop you from doing what's right. This woman has been stealing from your neighbors and lying to everyone about your property. The truth needs to come out. That evening, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset over my lake when I saw headlights coming down my driveway again. For a moment, I worried that it might be the police again, but as the vehicle got closer, I could see it was just a regular car. Tom Rodriguez got out and walked up to my porch, looking worried and excited at the same time. Jake, you need to know something, he said breathlessly. I just came from another emergency HOA meeting, and things got really crazy. What happened? I asked, gesturing for him to sit down. Well, Dorothy Williams stood up and started asking detailed questions about the HOA budget and where all the money from the lake access fees has been going. Margaret tried to dismiss her questions, but Dorothy kept pressing for answers. Good for Dorothy, I said. What did Margaret say? That's when things got weird, Tom continued. Margaret started getting really defensive and angry. She said that financial records were private and that residents didn't have a right to see detailed budgets. But then Robert Kim, the treasurer, spoke up and said that wasn't true. HOA members absolutely have a right to see how their money is being spent. It sounds like Margaret is losing control of the situation, I observed. That's exactly what it seemed like. But then she did something that shocked everyone. Tom paused dramatically. She announced that if the community didn't support her plan to claim the lake through adverse possession, she would resign from the HOA board immediately and the community would have to deal with the legal mess on their own. I raised my eyebrows. She threatened to quit? Not just threatened, she actually walked out of the meeting. She said she was tired of dealing with ungrateful residents and outside troublemakers, meaning you, and that if people didn't appreciate everything she'd done for the community, they could handle their own problems. This was an interesting development. If Margaret resigned, it might be easier to work with new HOA leadership to resolve the property dispute honestly. But something about this felt wrong. Tom, do you think she's really going to resign, or is this just another manipulation tactic? Tom thought for a moment. I'm not sure, but here's the thing, after she left, Robert Kim took over the meeting and said he wanted to look into all of Dorothy's questions about the budget. He seemed genuinely concerned about some of the financial issues she raised. What kind of issues? Well, Dorothy had done some research and found that the HOA has been paying for things that don't seem legitimate. Like, there's a monthly payment to something called Community Management Services for $2,000, but no one knows what company that is or what services they're providing. I had a pretty good idea what that was, based on what Dorothy had told me earlier. Did anyone at the meeting recognize that company name? No, and that's what was so strange about it. Robert said he'd been signing checks to them every month because Margaret told him to, but he'd never actually seen any services being provided. What happens next? Robert scheduled another meeting for this weekend where he wants to go through all the HOA financial records with a committee of residents. He said if there are problems with how money has been spent, they need to be addressed immediately. After Tom left, I sat on my porch thinking about this new development. It seemed like Margaret's aggressive tactics were finally backfiring, and the truth about both the property dispute and the financial irregularities was starting to come out. But I had a feeling that Margaret Thompson wasn't going to go down without a fight. Someone who had been lying and potentially stealing for years wouldn't just walk away quietly when their scheme started to unravel. I was right to be concerned. The next morning, I woke up to discover that someone had been on my property during the night, and what they'd done was going to turn this already complicated situation into something much more serious and dangerous. I stepped outside to check on my workshop before starting my morning coffee routine when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The lock on my workshop door had been cut clean through with bolt cutters, and the door was hanging wide open. But that wasn't the worst part. As I approached cautiously, I could see that someone had completely trashed the inside of my workshop. My tools were scattered everywhere, workbenches were overturned, and several of my handmade wooden projects that I'd spent months creating were smashed to pieces on the floor. But the most disturbing discovery was what I found spray-painted in bright red letters across my back wall: "Leave now or else." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call the police. This had gone way beyond a property dispute or even financial fraud. Someone had committed breaking and entering, vandalism, and was now making direct threats against me. And I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. Officer Martinez, the same policeman who had responded to the trespassing call, arrived within 20 minutes. He walked through my destroyed workshop, taking pictures and shaking his head. "Mr. Peterson, this is serious criminal activity," he said grimly. "Breaking and entering, vandalism, terroristic threatening, we're looking at multiple felony charges here. Do you have any idea who might have done this?" "Officer, I hate to accuse anyone without proof, but this is obviously connected to my ongoing dispute with the HOA. The timing is too convenient to be a coincidence." I told him about Margaret's threat to resign and the upcoming financial investigation. "We'll dust for fingerprints and look for any other evidence," Officer Martinez said. "But I have to ask, do you feel safe staying here? Whoever did this clearly wanted to intimidate you, and they might escalate further if they don't get the response they're looking for." The thought of being driven from my own property by criminal threats made me angry, but I also had to be realistic about my safety. I'm not going to let bullies chase me away from my home, I said firmly. But I'll definitely be more careful and maybe invest in some security cameras. After the police finished their investigation, I called my lawyer David to report what had happened. Jake, this changes everything, David said urgently. We're not just dealing with civil disputes anymore. Someone has committed serious crimes, and they're escalating their tactics. I think it's time to go on the offensive legally, but more importantly, you need to think about your personal safety. I've been thinking about that, I said. But I'm not going to be intimidated into abandoning my rights. If anything, this criminal behavior proves that we're on the right track. Someone is getting desperate. I agree, but desperate people do desperate things. Let me contact the district attorney's office today about both the potential embezzlement and these criminal threats. It's time to bring in law enforcement at the highest level. That afternoon, I got a call from Dorothy Williams that provided some fascinating new information. Jake, I hope you're okay after what happened to your workshop, she said, her voice full of concern. Word is spreading through the neighborhood about the break-in, and people are shocked that things have gotten this violent. Thank you for your concern, Dorothy. Did the HOA financial meeting happen as planned? Oh yes, and you're not going to believe what we discovered. Robert Kim and I spent 3 hours going through every financial record we could find, and the situation is even worse than I thought. Dorothy explained that they had found evidence of systematic financial misconduct going back at least 3 years. The mysterious community management services payments were indeed going directly to Margaret Thompson. She had created a fake company to pay herself $2,000 per month in addition to her official HOA compensation. But that wasn't all. Margaret has been using HOA funds to pay for all kinds of personal expenses, Dorothy continued. Her home security system, her landscaping, even her monthly spa membership, all charged to the HOA under various fake categories like community safety and board member wellness programs. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Robert estimates that Margaret has stolen at least $75,000 over the past 3 years, maybe more. And that's on top of the $150,000 the HOA collected for lake access fees that they had no right to charge. What's the HOA planning to do about this? Robert is calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow night to present the evidence to all residents. He's also talking about filing a police report for embezzlement and removing Margaret from the board immediately. This was exactly what I'd hoped would happen. The truth was finally coming out, and the community was going to hold Margaret accountable for her actions. But it also meant that Margaret was going to become even more desperate and potentially dangerous. That evening, as I was installing new security cameras around my property, I got an unexpected visitor. Tom Rodriguez pulled into my driveway, but he wasn't alone. Sarah Chen was with him, along with Mr. Franklin and 3 other residents I recognized from the neighborhood. Jake, we came to apologize, Tom said as the group approached my porch. We heard about what happened to your workshop, and were horrified that things have gotten this bad. Sarah stepped forward, looking upset. We also came to tell you that we figured out what's really been going on. Dorothy and Robert shared their findings with us, and we realized that you've been telling the truth all along while Margaret has been lying to everyone. We feel terrible, added Mr. Franklin. You've been nothing but generous and kind to us, letting us use your lake even when the HOA was treating you badly. And meanwhile, Margaret has been stealing our money and using it to pay for her personal expenses. I was touched by their apology, but I was also concerned about their safety. Thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your support. But I'm worried that whoever broke into my workshop might target anyone who stands up against Margaret. You all need to be careful. That's actually another reason we're here, Tom said. We want to make sure you know that you're not alone in this fight anymore. Margaret has been dividing the community with lies and manipulation, but now that people know the truth, most residents are on your side. Sarah nodded. We're planning to attend tomorrow night's HOA meeting in force. Margaret needs to be removed from the board and held accountable for what she's done. What if she doesn't show up to the meeting? I asked. She might realize that her schemes have been exposed and just disappear. Oh, she'll be there, Mr. Franklin said with a knowing smile. Robert sent her a certified letter today informing her that the board is calling for her immediate resignation due to financial irregularities. If she doesn't attend the meeting to defend herself, the board will vote to remove her automatically. The next evening, I decided to attend the HOA meeting myself. I knew it might be risky, given the recent threats and violence, but I felt like I needed to be there to see this situation through to its conclusion. The community center was packed with more residents than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting. Dorothy had told me that word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about Margaret's financial crimes, and people were angry about being deceived and stolen from. Margaret did show up, but she looked completely different from the confident, controlling woman I'd dealt with for months. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes were wrinkled, and she had dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping. She sat alone at the front table, clutching a folder of papers and glaring at anyone who made eye contact with her. Robert Kim called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the financial irregularities that had been discovered. Ladies and gentlemen, after conducting a thorough review of our HOA financial records, we have discovered evidence of serious misconduct by our board president, Margaret Thompson. Robert's voice was steady and professional, but I could hear the anger underneath. Over the past 3 years, Mrs. Thompson has used HOA funds for personal expenses totaling approximately $75,000. The room erupted in angry voices and shocked gasps. Margaret stood up abruptly, her face red with rage. "This is a witch hunt," she shouted. "You people don't understand the sacrifices I've made for this community. I've worked day and night to protect your property values and maintain our quality of life. By stealing our money," called out someone from the back of the room. "By lying about the lake ownership," added another voice. Margaret's composure completely cracked. "I never stole anything. Every penny I spent was for legitimate community purposes. And as for that lake, we have every right to it. This community has invested thousands of dollars in improvements, and I won't let some outsider come in and steal what we've built." I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention on me. "Mrs. Thompson, I've never tried to steal anything from anyone. I've simply asked you to acknowledge that the lake is on my private property, which is clearly documented in the county records." Margaret whirled around to face me, her eyes blazing with fury. This is all your fault. Everything was fine until you started causing trouble with your fake documents and your lies." "The documents aren't fake," I said calmly. "And I haven't told any lies. I've been trying to resolve this situation peacefully for months, but you've responded with harassment, threats, and now criminal violence." "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret snapped, but I could see panic in her eyes. Robert Kim spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson, we also need to address the fact that someone broke into Mr. Peterson's workshop last night and vandalized his property. Given the timing and the escalating nature of this conflict, the police are investigating whether this crime is connected to the HOA dispute." Margaret's face went pale. "You can't blame me for every bad thing that happens in this neighborhood. I had nothing to do with any break-in." But her nervous reaction made it clear to everyone in the room that she knew more about the vandalism than she was admitting. Dorothy Williams stood up and addressed the room. "Friends and neighbors, we need to face the truth about what's been happening in our community. Margaret Thompson has been lying to us about the lake ownership, stealing our money for personal use, and now it appears she may be involved in criminal harassment and vandalism against Mr. Peterson." "That's not true!" Margaret screamed. "I've given everything to this community. I've protected you from developers who wanted to build cheap housing next to our neighborhood. I've maintained our property values. I've made this place special. By committing fraud and theft?" Robert asked quietly. Margaret grabbed her folder and started backing toward the exit. "I don't have to listen to this anymore. You people are all ungrateful, and you deserve whatever happens to this community without my leadership." "Margaret, wait," called Tom Rodriguez. "If you've made mistakes, we can work together to fix them. But you need to stop running from the truth and take responsibility for what you've done." Margaret paused at the door and turned back with a look of pure hatred. "You want the truth? The truth is that I built this community from nothing. I made it special. And I'll be damned if I let anyone destroy what I've created." With that, she stormed out of the meeting, leaving behind a room full of shocked and angry residents. Robert Kim took control of the situation immediately. Given Mrs. Thompson's refusal to address the evidence of financial misconduct and her apparent flight from accountability, I'm calling for an immediate vote to remove her from the HOA board and revoke all her authority over community funds and decisions. The vote was unanimous, not a single person supported Margaret Thompson. Our next step, Robert continued, is to contact law enforcement about the embezzlement and to work with Mr. Peterson to resolve the lake access issue honestly and legally. After the meeting, dozens of residents came up to me to apologize for how I'd been treated and to express their support for finding a fair solution to the property dispute. Many of them also shared stories about how Margaret had bullied or manipulated them over the years, and how relieved they were to finally be free of her control. "Jake, what do you want to do about the lake access?" Sarah Chen asked. "A lot of us would love to continue using it, but we want to do it the right way. I've always been open to sharing the lake with good neighbors," I told her. "Now that we can have honest conversations about it, I'm sure we can work out an agreement that's fair for everyone." But our celebration of truth and community was short-lived. 2 days later, I woke up to discover that Margaret Thompson had made one final, desperate attempt to get revenge on me and the community that had rejected her. I was having my morning coffee when I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer and closer. When I looked out my window, I could see smoke rising from the direction of the Willow Creek Estates Community Center. I drove over immediately and found the building engulfed in flames, with fire trucks and police cars surrounding the area. The community center, where we'd held the meeting that exposed Margaret's crimes just 2 days earlier, was completely destroyed. Officer Martinez found me in the crowd of neighbors watching the fire and pulled me aside. "Mr. Peterson, we need to talk," he said grimly. "The fire marshal says this was definitely arson. Someone used accelerant to make sure the building would burn fast and hot. And we found something interesting in the parking lot." He led me to where Margaret Thompson's car was parked behind the building, with the engine still warm and the keys on the ground beside it. "We think she set the fire and then fled on foot," Officer Martinez explained. "We've issued a warrant for her arrest, but she seems to have disappeared completely." As we stood there watching the community center burn, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness that someone's anger and desperation had led to such destructive behavior, but relief that the truth had finally come out and that Margaret's reign of lies and manipulation was over. Tom Rodriguez walked up to us, his face grim but determined. "Jake, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything. The community is still behind you, and we're still going to work together to fix the mess Margaret created." "What about the HOA?" I asked. "With the community center destroyed and all the financial records?" "We'll rebuild," said Dorothy Williams, joining our conversation. "And we'll do it honestly this time, with full transparency and respect for everyone's rights, including yours." Over the next few weeks, as the police manhunt for Margaret Thompson continued, the Willow Creek Estates community came together in ways that amazed me. Instead of being divided by conflict and lies, residents were united by their shared commitment to doing the right thing. Robert Kim, now serving as interim HOA president, worked with my lawyer David to create a formal lake access agreement. The community would pay me a reasonable annual fee that actually reflected the value of the access they were receiving, and in return, I would maintain the lake area and allow reasonable recreational use by residents. The best part was that the agreement included provisions for community involvement in lake maintenance and improvement projects. Residents could volunteer their time and skills to help with landscaping, fish stocking, and facility maintenance, creating a true partnership instead of the adversarial relationship Margaret had fostered. Tom Rodriguez organized weekend volunteer crews to help repair my vandalized workshop, and I was touched by how many neighbors showed up with tools and materials to help. Sarah Chen's kids even made me a handmade, "Welcome to Jake's Lake" sign to replace the angry graffiti that had been spray-painted on my property. Mr. Franklin, the elderly gentleman who loved reading by the water, approached me with a particularly meaningful gesture. "Jake, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I want to do something to help heal the damage," he said one afternoon as we sat by the lake together. "I'd like to organize a community reconciliation picnic right here by the water. A celebration of truth, forgiveness, and new beginnings." "That sounds wonderful, Mr. Franklin," I said, feeling touched by his kindness. I also want to put up a small plaque by the lake," he continued. "Something that reminds everyone about the importance of honesty, kindness, and treating your neighbors with respect." The reconciliation picnic was held on a beautiful Saturday in October, with over 100 residents attending. People brought homemade dishes to share, kids played games by the water, and families enjoyed the peaceful beauty of the lake together. But the most meaningful moment came when Robert Kim stood up to address the crowd. "Friends and neighbors," Robert said, his voice carrying across the water, "we're here today not just to enjoy this beautiful setting, but to remember an important lesson. For too long, our community was divided by lies, fear, and selfishness. But when we chose to embrace truth, kindness, and respect for each other, we discovered that we could solve any problem together." He gestured toward the small bronze plaque that Mr. Franklin had installed by the water's edge. It read, "In memory of the power of truth and kindness to heal communities and bring neighbors together. Willow Creek Estates, October 2025. As for Margaret Thompson, she was eventually captured 3 states away and charged with multiple felonies including embezzlement, arson, and criminal harassment. During her trial, it came out that she had been struggling with severe financial problems and had started stealing from the HOA to cover her debts. When the theft was discovered, her desperation had led her to increasingly destructive behavior. I felt genuinely sorry for Margaret during her trial. I could see that she was a person who had made terrible choices because of fear, pride, and desperation. While her actions had caused real harm, I hoped that she would get the help she needed and eventually find a way to make amends for what she'd done. The prosecutor asked me if I wanted to give a victim impact statement at her sentencing, but I declined. Instead, I wrote a letter to the judge asking for leniency and explaining that I believed Margaret needed treatment and rehabilitation, not just punishment. "Your Honor," I wrote, "while Mrs. Thompson's actions caused significant harm to me and many others, I believe she is fundamentally a person who lost her way rather than someone who is evil. I hope that her sentence will focus on helping her understand the impact of her choices and giving her the tools to make better decisions in the future." Margaret was sentenced to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years if she completed restitution payments and anger management counseling. I never spoke to her directly again, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that she eventually wrote apology letters to many of the people she had harmed. Today, 2 years later, the Willow Creek Estates community is thriving in ways it never did under Margaret's authoritarian leadership. The HOA operates with complete financial transparency, decisions are made democratically with input from all residents, and there's a genuine spirit of cooperation and mutual respect among neighbors. My lake has become the heart of the community in the best possible way. Kids learn to fish there with their grandparents, families have birthday parties by the water, and couples get engaged on the little dock that we all maintain together. The community pays me a fair fee for access, but more importantly, residents contribute their time and skills to keep the area beautiful and welcoming for everyone. I've also discovered that I love being part of a real community. For years, I thought I wanted to live in isolation, but the experience of working with my neighbors to overcome conflict and build something positive together has been incredibly rewarding. Tom Rodriguez and I have become close friends, often spending Sunday mornings fishing together and talking about life. Sarah Chen's kids call me Uncle Jake and love helping me with woodworking projects in my rebuilt workshop. Dorothy Williams and I serve together on the HOA board, where we focus on maintaining the values of honesty and kindness that helped heal our community. Most importantly, I've learned that my grandmother's advice about kindness and empathy was right, but it needed to be balanced with the courage to stand up for what's right. Being kind doesn't mean allowing people to walk all over you. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is hold people accountable for their actions so they can learn and grow. Every evening when I sit on my porch watching the sunset reflect off the water, I'm reminded that even the most difficult conflicts can be resolved when people choose truth over lies, community over selfishness, and hope over fear. The lake that was once a source of division has become a symbol of what neighbors can accomplish when they work together with honest hearts and good intentions. And sometimes, late in the evening when the water is perfectly still, I can almost hear my grandmother's voice carried on the gentle breeze. "See, Jake? Kindness and truth always win in the end." That's the real lesson of this whole crazy story. Not that conflict is inevitable, or that some people are just evil, but that when we choose to respond to challenges with grace, honesty, and community spirit, even the worst situations can become opportunities for healing and growth. If this story has inspired you or taught you something valuable, make sure to subscribe for more amazing true stories about the power of community, kindness, and standing up for what's right. And remember, in your own life, when you're faced with conflict or difficult people, you always have a choice between responding with anger and fear, or responding with truth and compassion. Choose wisely, because that choice doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone around you and helps shape the kind of world we all live in together.